Today we're going to find the best Z490 ITX motherboard on the market, and we'll be comparing the top offerings from ASUS, MSI, ASRock, and Gigabyte. With all of these ITX boards supporting the new 10-core 10900K, which is potentially a very power-hungry CPU, all of these manufacturers have beefed up these boards quite a bit. If you were just expecting these to be slight Z390i refreshes like I was, we're definitely getting quite a bit more than that, with each of these boards bringing really interesting features to the table. So if you are currently planning a Z490 ITX build and you are looking for a new board for 10900K or 10700K, let's take a look at which of these boards are the better options. And spoiler alert, it is not an easy choice at all. So there are a few main questions that I want to answer in this review. Firstly, what is the stock 10900K power profile on each of these ITX boards, and do any of them run the 10900K at completely unlocked power? Secondly, I want to take a look at the single-threaded performance and see whether there are any major differences there. And the third main one comes down to the VRM design and thermals, and whether these boards kind of struggle with the 10900K pulling over 200 watts. But before we get stuck into the performance numbers and the in-depth comparisons, let's just take a quick brief overview of what boards we are actually looking at here. So first up, we have the ASUS Z490i ROG Strix, and the ROG ITX boards have always been a popular option for enthusiasts because for previous chipsets, ASUS have generally taken their ITX boards pretty seriously. One thing that some of you might notice right away is that internal USB Type-C header, which is thankfully a bit more common now on Z490, but definitely won't be on every board that you come across. You've got room for two M.2 NVMe drives on a separate PCB that plugs directly in above the PCIe slot, and this is a similar design to what we've seen from their X570i board. This is opposed to putting the secondary M.2 slot on the back of the motherboard, which is very common for ITX boards, but that also means that it'll be starved for airflow when installed into a case. The approach here should be much better in terms of M.2 SSD thermals. There is also a VRM fan hiding behind that I/O shroud, which will provide some welcome active cooling should those power stages start warming up. If you are planning on using a CPU pump block or an ITX case with limited motherboard airflow, active VRM cooling can definitely be beneficial. Rear I/O here is going to be solid enough for most users, including Wi-Fi 6, 2.5 gigabit LAN, and a handy BIOS flashback for next-gen CPUs. Moving on to the MSI Z490i Unify, and this is without a doubt the cleanest looking and also the most powerful ITX motherboard that I've seen from MSI. The Unify also has an internal Type-C header and three 4-pin fan headers just like the ASUS Strix, but the Unify has the much more conventional approach to M.2 storage with one of those slots on the back. It also has a bit more clearance for large CPU pump blocks and heatsinks compared to the Strix, and also the next motherboard that we'll take a look at. This board does actually have active cooling, pulling air from the rear I/O. However, it blows directly onto a heat pipe instead of a heatsink, so I'm not really sure how effective that's going to be. Realistically though, that can be excused when we take a look at the VRM design underneath. More on that though in just a minute. Rear I/O here is fairly solid, and the standout feature is actually Thunderbolt 3 support, which is capable of speeds of up to 40 gigabits per second, as well as Wi-Fi 6 and 2.5 gigabit LAN. You'll also find a clear CMOS button back here, which is very handy if your system ever freezes up or locks up due to an unstable overclock. This will quickly reset your BIOS and get you back up and running. Next up, we have the very interesting Z490i Phantom Gaming from ASRock, one of the most interesting motherboards that I've seen in recent times. Here we actually have a SODIMM board that includes your primary M.2 slot, two SATA ports, and a USB 2.0 header. We also find the most insane VRM cooling setup on any Z490i motherboard here, three separate heatsinks, and two fans for active VRM cooling. In ITX cases like the Ncase M1, where you potentially basically have radiator fans blowing directly onto the front of the motherboard. Actively cooled VRMs are honestly a bit redundant, but for more airflow restricted cases like the Dan A4, they can definitely reduce VRM thermals. Now that's all well and good, I'm all for lower VRM thermals, but not when it comes at the cost of worse CPU cooler compatibility. As an example, the ever popular NZXT Kraken series are incompatible here. They just flat out don't fit on this board because the pump leads either come in contact with 3 of those heatsinks or your memory DIMMs. The ROG Strix board is almost as bad in this regard also, but can kind of support the Kraken coolers with the pump leads above the top heatsink. Just like the MSI Unify, the Phantom Gaming has that Thunderbolt 3 port and also clear CMOS, so if you're really after that Thunderbolt 3 connectivity, you've got 2 really solid options here. And lastly, we have the Z490i Aorus Ultra from Gigabyte, which is a bit more reserved on the surface like MSI's Unify, and does offer the best heatsink and pump block compatibility out of the 4. That is after you remove the fairly pointless block of metal that attaches the M.2 heatsink, not even with a thermal pad between them. In my opinion, this seems completely useless and is probably just there for looks. One thing I do love about this board though is the use of mini 4-pin fan connectors. Don't worry, you do get an adapter for each included in the box, but this allows Gigabyte to cram 4 4-pin headers onto this board in total. They also include a splitter for the USB 2.0 port, which is nice and handy. VRM heatsink design here looks pretty solid and connects to the primary M.2 drive via a heat pipe. You do also have a secondary M.2 slot on the back. Do note this is the only board without an actively cooled VRM. Rear I/O is almost identical to the Asus Z490i Strix. You don't get that special Thunderbolt 3 port or clear CMOS button like on the ASRock Phantom or MSI Unify, but I think it's packed enough for most users. Now let's take a look at what the VRM looks like for each board, an important consideration if you're planning on overclocking the 10900K. Let's start with the weakest VRM configuration in terms of total power output and then work our way to the strongest. So the Z490i ROG Strix from Asus has the weakest VRM out of the 4 here, but it's by no means terrible and will run an overclocked 10900K at 250 watts and slightly above no problem. Here we're working with a twin 4+1 PWM phase setup. That means that there are 2 power stages per PWM channel. We get 8 TDA21462 60 amp power stages for the V-Core VRM and another 2 for the system agent. So definitely not bad at all, and it's a very similar setup to what we've seen on previous ROG boards like the X570i Strix and Crosshair 8 Impact. I'd say the ASRock Phantom Gaming follows closely next with a 6+3 phase VRM setup with 6 ISL 99390s for the V-Core and 3 ISL 9927s for the system agent and I/O. ASRock probably have the best heatsink design out of the 4 though, so do note if you're planning on putting this in a very cramped case. Gigabyte's Aorus Ultra is up next with a direct 8+1 phase VRM setup. That's 8 true phases for the V-Core, no doubled or twin phases. Not just that, but each V-Core phase gets an ISL 99390, the same 90 amp power stages that ASRock are using. We also have a single 50 amp power stage for the system agent. So the Gigabyte board doesn't have any active VRM cooling, but with 8 90 amp power stages for the V-Core VRM, you realistically don't need any. And so that leaves MSI's Z490i Unify with the best VRM setup, although it is extremely similar to Gigabyte's Aorus Ultra. It is powered by the same ISL 69269 PWM controller, pushing out 8 PWM phases for the 90 amp ISL 99390 power stages, but here we have an additional power stage and channel likely for that Thunderbolt 3 port. Overall, the Unify and the Gigabyte Ultra have some of the strongest VRM designs that you'll find on any ITX board, but this is only really relevant if you're pushing a 10900K to the wall. More on that in just a minute. So now that we've taken a pretty solid look at the surface of all of these ITX motherboards, let's now really dig into the testing. And the first thing that I want to kind of discuss here is how each of these boards run the 10900K out of the box. Because as some of you might know at this point, some Z490 motherboards will restrict the 10900K to its spec long duration power limit of 125 watts, whereas other motherboards will kind of just give the 10900K as much juice as it wants. and the results here are actually pretty interesting. Both the MSI and Gigabyte board ran the 10900K with a virtually unlocked power limit, allowing it to boost to 4.9 GHz over a sustained period, whereas the ASUS and ASRock board both limited the 10900K to 125 watts for the long duration power limit. This isn't something that should be used as a purchasing factor if you're watching this video, because it is easy to find and adjust that power limit for each of these boards, but it is definitely a handy thing to know if you do end up with any of them. What's also interesting to look at is what each motherboard decides is a reasonable voltage to run the 10900K at when the power limit is completely lifted. And you can see here that all of these boards run the 10900K with a fairly reasonable stock voltage of around 1.25 volts. Probably the standout was the Gigabyte board running the most inefficient of the four at 1.32 volts and almost 220 watts. That means that it'll run the 10900K the warmest out of these boards as well. In terms of overclocking potential, this is mostly something that is going to come down to the quality of silicon within the CPU that you end up with, but my experience was almost identical for all of these ITX boards tested. I opted for a more realistic overclock this time around to try and see what the experience was like for each board, and the only thing really worth mentioning is that I think the LLC options for the Gigabyte board need a bit of tuning on the BIOS side. I did find the voltage to just jump around a bit more in the monitoring software compared to the other three boards, and that meant that it just required a bit more voltage at the same frequency. Single-threaded performance for the 10900K was very similar for all of these ITX boards, right around where you would expect, and nothing really worth mentioning here. To test VRM thermals on each board, I locked the 10900K to 5.1 GHz and 1.25 volts, which had it pulling around 210 watts, and ran a Blender render for 30 minutes. The temperature reading that you see here is reported from the PWM controller, and the neat thing here is that the ASRock, MSI, and Gigabyte board all use the same one, the ISL 69269, so readout accuracy here should be pretty spot on. The Z490i Strix ran the warmest out of the four, finishing up at 61 degrees C, and I think we'd all agree that that is still a very safe level. Realistically, unless you are completely starving the motherboard of airflow and somehow at the same time running a heavily overclocked 10900K in an ITX case, I struggle to see how any of these VRM setups on these boards could become a problem. Having said that, the MSI and Gigabyte board do get extra points here. That's only fair because if you remember, they do have the strongest VRM setup of the four, and that does reflect in the thermal testing here too. Personally, I think this is probably the most competitive ITX motherboard lineup that I've seen, with each of these options being viable for the 10900K overclocked as well, and they each have their own kind of strong points and features that they're bringing to the table. For example, the ASUS Z490i Strix likely offers the best M.2 drive thermals, although that's not something that I had the time to test. The ASRock board brings Thunderbolt 3 and a potentially useful active VRM cooling setup. The Gigabyte board offers the most fan headers and also packs 90 amp power stages, as does the MSI board, which additionally packs Thunderbolt 3. Simply put, you really can't go wrong with any of these Z490 ITX boards for an overclocked 10900K, and to make your choice a bit harder, they're all priced very closely together, between $270 US and $300 US. If I had to choose one for personal use, it would either be the Gigabyte Aorus Ultra or the MSI Z490i Unify, because not only did they have the strongest and coolest running VRM setups, but they also have the best kind of CPU cooler compatibility. So if you're planning on running a bigger Noctua heatsink, or for example, a CPU pump block on here, that's where the Aorus Ultra and the MSI Unify would definitely be better choices. Again though, the other two boards are completely viable. Maybe you don't want your second M.2 drive to be starved for airflow on the back of the motherboard. That's where the ASUS Strix would be a very suitable option. And maybe you are, for some reason, planning on starving your motherboard for airflow. That's where the active VRM cooling on the ASRock Phantom would be very suitable. I'll also quickly note that if you are planning on going with the 10700K instead of the 10900K, which is totally fine, then the discussion of VRM thermals and VRM design kind of becomes irrelevant, and that's not a reason to get the MSI or Gigabyte board over the ASRock or ASUS in my opinion. Even the ASUS with its twin 4+1 setup will run an overclocked 10700K, no problem at all. And if you are going for the i5 10600K, which is even a step down in terms of total power output, I would instead go for the much cheaper version that ASRock are currently making, which is I think around $160. That board will have no problem at all running a 6-core 10600K. Otherwise, all four of these boards are very suitable options for the 10900K, and I will leave the decision up to you guys because there really is no clear pick. If you are interested in picking any of them up, I will leave them linked down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.